Good afternoon, councillors and officers, and welcome to the working group meeting today. This working group meeting is being live streamed. So members, thank you for attending. Just a few words from me as the monitoring officer before I hand over to Philip McCourt, who is our external advisor from Bevan Britton. Just two very quick points. To say that we do have a dedicated web page now, which you would find on our internet, which is for the benefit of the public and anybody else internally, officers who want to be kept abreast of the developments in this change process. So there is a dedicated web page on our website, which we will keep updated. And we will obviously keep everybody informed as to the progress being made during these working group meetings and outside of this working group meeting as well. The second point that I wanted to make is, as members are aware, during the full council last week, you kindly gave us permission to appoint a fourth member to the IRP panel. Thank you for that permission and that go ahead. Just to let you know that I will be working with committee services in order to appoint a fourth member on the panel. And the plan is to ask the panel to convene towards the end of this year, once we have a clearer indication of our likely structure so that they can carry out their review. So those were the two intro points that I wanted to make before I formally hand over to Philip McCourt. Philip, thank you.
Thanks, Amandeep. Can everyone hear me on these wonderful machines? Super. It was difficult to know how to get our tone right, and switching from Teams to Zoom, and they each have their delightful little quirks, don't they? Members, we came away with a task from your last meeting, and the response to that to discuss through today is a number of papers, but actually we've condensed that to one particular paper and some slides, which I'll share with you if I may. Yeah, that should be with you now.
We can see that, Philip.
Super. So, members, this was your ask for us to take away from the previous meeting, and that was a two policy committee structure. And sorry, members, if someone hasn't got their microphone muted, it's providing some feedback. Thank you. That should help. So just to explain, what you now do is what's commonly referred to as your executive arrangements. So that's the effectively leader and cabinet, with some of the functions in the other committees in the committee system are referred to as the policy committees. That's the formal term for them. So that's everything other than the regulatory matters and things that go before full council. So the ask was to go away and produce the draft for a two committee structure with a working title of P&R or Resources Committee, that there was to be no overview and scrutiny function. And could we produce terms of reference for them with a diagram? We have produced a very first draft of detailed terms of reference. We've not shared those with you as yet because they're still being gone through with your officers, and we feel there's a fair bit of work to be done, which underscores the good sense in you asking for it to be produced in a diagram or diagrammatic form, and we noted the number of 12 each. Alongside that, in terms of a scheme of delegation, because that will be quite different, would be a scheme by reservation, And alongside that, retaining, because you don't have to now at law have to retain the concept of a forward plan and key decisions, but actually that would give you the ability to deal with those more important decisions to be made in terms of what you do with them through the committee system, and to differentiate from members of the public in terms of the openness and advance notice of those decisions coming. So alongside that scheme of delegation by exception, i.e. instead of a big long list of things that you would ask officers to do, actually what you're saying is officers get on with things unless they are reserved to committee, because in the committee system you will need that flexibility between meetings to have much smoother decision making, much faster and more agile working. The flip side of that is you asked us to produce for you a draft of how a scheme might work, whereby those key decisions due to be taken by officers could be subject to members asking them to come into, so for in effect for delegation to be removed and those decisions to be made by committee and how that might be done. So that's something for you to chew over. There were then, and this is fairly novel, is the idea of council spokespersons. So in a way reflecting the cabinet members you have now in terms of leads for the council, particular specialisms to assist the committees. What would that look like? So we produce the role description, and then finally an example of the committee systems version, if you like, of call-in, if you don't have overview and scrutiny, which is actually a version of call-in, but with slightly sharper teeth. So this is what that looks like. So that's what you have now, just to make it look pretty, which is cabinet, and of course understanding that individual cabinet members may make decisions distinct from anything that happens in public, and that's entirely at the gift of the leader of the day. And alongside that, in any executive arrangements, is the overview and scrutiny, which is one of your committees, at least one of your committees, turned into a committee that only fulfills the functions of overview and scrutiny as it's set out in law. You then have the planning and licensing committee and subcommittees, which undertakes those regulatory functions, which are all of those matters that are not executive functions, so are not allowed to be decisions made by cabinet, but are to be made by council or committees, and those are exercised over there in green. And then what's known as the other committees, which is audit and governance. So being able to stand slightly aside from politics, as it were, and look at the risk culture of the council, signing off audit and accounts, looking at the annual governance statement, and dealing with standards of conduct within the authority. And then the bit that sits in between all of those, which is your personnel committee, because again, that's something that is not a cabinet function that's reserved to full council, but actually needs a member of the cabinet on it. So that sits slightly to one side. So that's the shape you have now, just to rehearse it for yourselves and anyone who may be watching this. So given that you want two major policy committees, there are only really two ways of doing it. And these are examples that have been exercised elsewhere in the country. One is to effectively turn the cabinet into a committee, so it becomes a politically balanced committee. There's no individual decision making by members. Everything has to be done in that committee, and everything is done in that committee. And that's balanced by an overview and scrutiny committee. That's how a number of councils began the whole cabinet system in the late 90s, and it's how a number of councils, such as yourselves, who only want to minimise the number of committees they have gone into matters sort of in the new world that you're in now, of the new forms of committee systems under the Localism Act. That keeps it simple in a way, because you've got one committee that does all the stuff cabinet does now, although you can put personnel matters in there, and then one committee that does overview and scrutiny and community engagement, as it does now. So crack on. The other way, which is what you discussed and favoured at your last meeting, is to do away with the formal bit of overview and scrutiny, but take that kind of methodology of community engagement into the committee system and effectively put all of the functions, policy committee functions, into one basket and then split it into two. And the beginnings of that you spoke of last time was as a resources committee, which would be, for want of a better word, the senior committee dealing with the money and policy, and then a communities committee or an environment and communities committee that dealt with a number of services that were taken out. Both of those committees would be politically balanced, as we say, no formal overview and scrutiny, and we can go on to discuss about how those committees may either choose to refer things up or members may ask for things to be referred up to them. So the big question for you to debate today is, if you're putting all of your eggs into that one basket or one cake, how are you going to slice that cake up into two? The draft in front of you effectively says that the resources committee deals with everything that is not taken to one side and delegated to the communities committee. And that will include a number of things that will require of that communities committee to approve, i.e., and you see the word, the capital N in here quite a bit, which is all of this is delegated to this other committee. All of these things are delegated to officers, except matters that deal with money over a certain level. And I've not put in the limits that you have at the moment in terms of officer delegation, because we're talking here as well about matters that will be undertaken by the communities committee, but it will be recognised that some things are so big they actually need to get passed from one committee to another. But the idea being those should be as far and few between. So resources committee dealing with the big policies, essentially formulating and putting the budget together, dealing with corporate matters. So the shareholder function, where you have interests in other committees, other bodies and companies, the what might be seen as traditionally the corporate central core of the council, so human resources, appointing representatives, emergency planning, and etc., etc., etc. So the list to really focus on is the other one, the communities committee, to say, right, if everything is in this basket and will be done by resources except what goes into the communities committee, what should those things be? And so what we've put here is a starter for 10, which is community engagement, community leadership, some of the things that overview and scrutiny did before, those environmental matters, so climate change, access to services, housing, so the council's landlord function, but also its non-HRA functions, environmental health, planning policy, so putting the local plan together, development plan documents, economic development and tourism, car parking, open space, environmental health, the enforcement powers that go with those. So all of those functions would sit in this committee in their entirety, as I say, except for the buying and selling of land over a certain level and the entering of contracts or the environment of budgets over a certain level. So I can either carry on and explain the rest, or you may actually want to stop there and have a little knockabout. Councillor McConville.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, it all looks fine. I mean, in terms of where things stand, because obviously P&R set the budgets, but full council set the budget, but they sort of deliver the budget. So I mean, because housing is a tricky one. Obviously, I sort of envisaged housing being sort of separate at the start, and then it was sort of thought that because they obviously have a HRA budget and large budget, that it would form mainly be part of the P&R. So are we talking just housing strategy and policy, or are we talking actually delivering the HRA budget?
So the starter for 10 is delivering the HRA. But as I say, this is entirely down for you as members. You have, in effect, you know, one piece of cake that in other places will be dealt with by just the one committee. You currently deal with it as just one cabinet, all of this stuff. And you've determined to divide this into 2 committees. So how you divide it is entirely a matter for you, you know, as members, and of course in discussion with your officers as to how they can organise their resources best to reflect this split. So as you know, some councils literally start with, well, what's the council's management structure? Let's have committees to fit that, which is a very traditional, you know, 1960s approach to local government. Others have gone completely reversed and said, right, we'll have one committee, effectively cabinet as was, and we'll do everything through that. So, you know, pay your money, take your choice. This is, as I say, is simply a starter for 10 for you to begin your discussions. And you may want to ask, you know, various questions of your officers as to their thoughts and how this might be might work in practice.
Sorry, I don't. I've forgotten how to use Zoom and how to put my hand up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
I mean, it looks a very comprehensive list in both committees, and I'm just wondering how, in reality, this is going to work in terms of the decision making, especially if you're looking for some relatively quick decisions. I mean, and the other question, I suppose, I was looking at the planning policy. Where does the planning committee sit under the resources committee, or does it sit under the communities? I'm just wondering where how that fits in with the committee, the planning committee.
Okay, so the planning committee as you have it now is distinct.
Yes, exactly.
So one of the things that we took away from last time, and if you don't mind me saying is very sensible, is to keep that distinct. So decisions on planning applications, development control, if you will sit in another committee as a regulatory committee.
So
this is about planning policy,
yes,
which at the moment is carried out by cabinet. So as I say, this is in effect these 2 lists are everything that cabinet does now that you are splitting into 2 committees. So it's the planning policy bit that cabinet currently does.
Right. Okay. I understand that. Right. I'll just have another think about what I'd got in my mind.
So which committee should it be is you know, the $1 million question. One might, and the starting point here is communities, and that element on community engagement may better fit planning policy. Others may say actually resources and what will in reality is the committee that will contain the group leaders keeping control of significant policies, and this is obviously one of them. It will be better there, and it really is, you know, your decision as to how you feel as members where that sits. Councillor Martin.
Thank you very much, Philip. Yeah, I echo that. Looks like a very comprehensive list, so I've got 2 questions. One, the audit and governance function, does that stay as similarly as a distinct separate function?
Yes, and it actually may help if I just show you what that looks like. So what this would look like, going back to that original picture. So that's as you've got now, and reflect taking those colours forward, as it were. You end up with this. So 2 policy committees, one being money corporate focused, the other being much more community engagement and scrutiny type focused, and then the other committees as with. So what was your personnel committee is absorbed into resources, albeit with staffing subcommittees, because you have to have those to deal with appointments and so forth. Audit and governance remaining exactly the same as it is now. And
Right,
then
thank
one
you.
of the things, and forgive me if this is going off the point slightly, discussed with your officers is actually going forward. It will be better, instead of trying to fit one set of members to do planning and regulatory licensing and licensing act hearings, it will be better to split that into two committees. So there's one straight planning committee doing development control, and one set of members doing the regulatory and the statutory committees for licensing.
Thank you very much. That's great. Could you just go back to the slide that explains the difference between the one committee and the two committees?
Yeah.
So I get this. This is very good. Now you know us fairly well. You've heard what we've said. We're moving out of a cabinet system towards a committee system. We're happy to adopt a committee system that is evolving and developing. So from where we stand now, and I won't sue you over this, Philip. What would your feelings be as the best fit for us, from what you know at the moment?
If having heard your debates and the way that you've spoken about it all, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but your primary objectives to give every political group and every political voice a voice and a solid vote that sits behind it to reflect the current political position of the council, to be able to say in full council, these X, Y, and Z is important, so needs to come to full council, not left to cabinet and cabinet members, because of course the current list is really a really hard line. I'd like a drink for every time I've had to say to a leader who genuinely says, this is far too important for me to decide on, I want to put it to council, and I go, no, I'm sorry, the law says you can't. And everybody gets frustrated. So to be able to do away with that, and to be able to stop the ability to have members making decisions in private, so that decisions are made in public and subject to that vote. Now, the easiest way to do that, and to pick up some of the discussion that you've had with your officers about wishing to retain this as business-like and streamlined, will be to step straight into this idea of one committee with an overview and scrutiny committee, because it's everything you're comfortable with. You don't have to argue about what goes to what committee, because there is in effect one cabinet committee, one resources committee. It can be as big or small as you like. You're no longer restrained by numbers, but it must be politically balanced and everybody gets a vote. And if you need to go away and do separate business as members, you can have a myriad of subcommittees and be able to discuss with officers, decisions in consultation with members, and everybody around that table as a policy and resources committee, as that top orange one there, can have the equivalent of a portfolio. These are the things that we want you to be interested in. So it's a kind of easy halfway step to the full committee system, because actually you've said you don't want a traditional committee system of 5 policy committees all doing various bits of the council and tripping over each other. You want something that's much more business-like. That top one is a lot more business-like.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Philip. That's exactly kind of where I am at the moment. I know I'll probably change my mind 2 or 3 times in the next few weeks or months, but it seems to me from everything you said to us thus far that this would be a good intermediate step, moving from a cabinet system to a one committee system, and then seeing if we want to evolve to a 2 committee system, or indeed more. But I'm not, that this doesn't mean anything. I'm just saying this is where I currently am at the moment, and I'm happy to take on board the other information and join the debate.
And I quite understand. We've had one of our clients started off saying we must have a streamlined, slick committee system, and then ended up with 9 policy committees. So, Councillor Pater.
I'm hopeful we avoid 9, and I hope people can hear me because I'm working on my phone. Am I?
Okay.
Oh, right, cool. I think that firstly, thank you for the documents provided. Although I've only been able to read them this morning, and mainly on a phone while wandering around a conference centre, they're genuinely really helpful, and it's a really good exposition of where we were to. I think that we were driving much more towards the 2-committee system, to be honest. And I think that the reason for that was to give that breadth of, is to widen the number of councillors actually involved in decisions, as opposed to having half of us involved in decisions and the other half looking at the decisions that the other half is making and making recommendations or suggestions on those things. Actually, by breaking it into 2 committees, that does broaden. You will have a series of decisions in the committee that you're in, a series of decisions which you are actively making. And I like the resources committee and communities committee approach that you're coming up with, and pretty much the split. I'm agnostic on which side of the line housing would fall. I quite like the fact, though, that because that sits with the communities committee, the right side of your diagram at the moment, that it's a very important piece of work, and it means that committee is not a sidelined committee. It is fundamental to what we're going to be doing as a council. I would say, and it's not crucial at this stage, but I think labelling things right is important. I think that's a community and environment committee. The word environment appears in that list more times than anything else. I think it's useful, useful to make sure that people who are on that committee are focused on what is important within it, and community and environment, as far as will help people focus on the importance of the roles of that. So without going into the other documents which provided, which we'll do in some more depth in a minute, but apart from to say that I think that they're very good, I'm really comfortable with where you're going at this moment. I think it's a really good understanding of what the conversations that we've had today, and the resources committee versus and the communities and environment committee. I like that split. I think it would work well for us. I think each of those committees being 12-member committees will then mean that there's a good number of councillors who are actually involved in making decisions and driving the way that the council works, as opposed to seeing things happen and potentially having some call in afterwards. So yeah, that's the split. So my answer to Jib's question would be, I'd go for the second one, because that's where this is driving to.
So Thomas.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, I support Tim's view actually in terms of the 2 committees for exactly the same reasons. I also think it allows us to address a point that that Jenny made in a previous meeting about how do you resource all of these, because as Jenny pointed out, when we operated committees many years ago, we had twice as many councillors as we have now. So again, I think just in terms of how we can actually share the workload out is part of it, but also the point that both Tim and Jim have made about making sure that we have a wider group of councillors involved directly in the decision making associated with this council. So I think it sits very comfortably with that. So I'd support the things that Tim have said in relation to the split. The only question I had on the housing side is where Opportunitas sits in all of this, and where the line is between the committee and Opportunitas and the way that functions. And I suppose the same thing applies to Waterpool as well, but I think that's for a little bit further down the road. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so, thank you, Councillor Thomas. Just in answer to your question, that sits there. So the suggestion putting forward is that you have a shareholder subcommittee that deals specifically with the council's relationship with the companies and organisations it owns, because they are arm's length organisations. So the relationship is established by the shareholder agreement or funding agreement or whatever other agreements and monitoring that there is. So the way this is evolving across the country is there is a code of governance that sits out there that describes the legal and finance relationship between councils and, say, the companies that they own, but then also sets out what decisions are reserved to the council as shareholder or as, you know, funder and investor, because actually those two things in themselves are quite distinct. So straight shareholder, and stop me when I've gone too far down this rabbit hole, but shareholder functions, for example, will be fairly infrequent, reviewing business plans, reviewing performance and making decisions on membership of a board. But a funding agreement actually involves very regular meetings, a lot closer view by the council of its investments and both financial and social returns on that investment, and a lot closer viewing. And you know, it's very sad to report that the number of places in the country that's gone terribly wrong. So you've got the opportunity here in building this new constitution to build in doing it right in the first instance. So I'll get off that soapbox and come back to this.
Thank you very much for that.
Members, do you want to speak any further about this, or just?
Yes, please. Sorry. Perhaps somebody can tell me how to raise my hand, because I cannot find it on this. I did send a message to say that I'd like to speak. Well, actually, it would be no surprise to anybody, I'm sure, to say that I totally agree with Jim. To be honest, I think that is exactly what we have now. So I don't really see a difference, other than it might be the overview and scrutiny might be more able to scrutinize, should I say. But I see that as if we are moving, and we obviously are moving to a committee system, but I see that as perhaps a first step that allows a bit more time for officers, a bit more time for members to actually get to grips with what this actually means. I mean, if we're the idea that we're going to have spokespeople for each of the different areas, then you know, it doesn't change, the whole thing doesn't change greatly from the cabinet system at the moment. So I'm just wondering why we're spending money, spending time doing this, and actually ending up with what we've already got.
I'm sure that's a debate you wouldn't want to rehearse quite now, members. Councillor McConville.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, personally, obviously, you know, as I've said in some of the earlier meetings, you know, I'm much more in favour of the two committee structure. You know, as it's been said, it puts decision making power into the hands of, you know, 24 out of 30 councillors. You know, and then having that facility where, you know, full council acts as the overview and scrutiny committee. In effect, if anything, you know, does sort of just decide to be called in, I think is really what we were aspiring to, you know, when we wanted to push this in the first place. And I think moving to that system is more of more significance, rather than sort of just saying we're just going to slightly tweak what we're doing and have almost more of the same. I think it's a clear departure, and obviously, you know, you obviously once you're there, you can adjust and things like that. I just think personally, I'd want to see a move more away from where we are now, because that's, you know, what we've been pushing for. You know, in terms of the what you've listed here, I mean, that's probably more than what I was originally hoping for. After before our first meeting, I sort of had something quite similar, but then I sort of chopped and changed some of it to sort of make it more heavily laden in P&R, and it does look more sort of even now. So that's quite good for myself.
Well, just to say again, members, taking this forward, this was just a sketch based on your conversation. So, this hasn't been discussed in any depth in the officers' management team, and obviously this is the first time you've seen this list. So as you said, Councillor McConville, it may be that you look at this list and say, actually, there's too far over to one side, and things need to change back and forth. So this is simply a starter for 10 for you to take back. If I hear it right, that the majority of members are wanting to go down this route, these are the lists for you to go back to your groups and for the management team to discuss as to how it best fit managerially as well. Because I think that's, if I dare say, is quite an important voice to ensure that the council is administered correctly. And so you can chop and change as you go forward. So that's your starter for 10. So just say this is what that would look like. So a resources committee doing finance, basically everything that isn't either reserved to council or specifically in the list of things in the what you might call the Environment and Communities Committee, because that's an easier way to do it. Because when you and officers are sitting down and saying where is a decision to be made, one easy way is it on the list of things for the community, environment and communities? Yes or no. If not, it goes to resources. It's a nice simple way of dealing with that. And as I say, there's a numbers game in there as well. Sorry, Councillor Prato, I didn't see your hand up. I do apologise.
That's okay. I would have waved more vigorously, but I just wanted to say that I accept that this is a sketch. I think it's a very good one. Again, well done on that. And I have to respond back to Jenny's points. The reason that we are doing this is because the current system is not proportional at Cabinet, and it is leader appointed at Cabinet. So it is at one person's discretion. It is not politically balanced, and it concentrates too many decisions in the hands of too few people. Leaving aside the procedural point, is that the other reason we're doing this is because council has agreed by a huge majority that we are doing this. But we are doing it for the purpose of widening out the number of councillors who are actually involved in decision making at our council. And therefore, the reason why I am firmly wedded to the two committee structure that's being proposed here is because it does that better than having one committee and a scrutiny committee which gets to stare in as it does at the moment and make some observations but has no particular power to make decisions. So there is a very good reason why we are making the change. It is a much more fundamental change than Jenny understands it to be because of political balance at that stage. And I think that if one is going to do it in order to widen the number of people who are involved in a politically balanced way, then you go the full hog at that stage, and we widen it as much as possible while keeping it streamlined. And what you have outlined here is a very good picture of how one can do that. So I'm really comfortable with the way that that's moving forward, and I really hope I can persuade Jim that is the right way to go.
Councillor Hollingby.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for that lecture, Tim. You have to remember also that I was a member of the committee system some time ago, although and I was very pleased when it moved to Cabinet. I don't disagree with your terms in terms of, but we are politically balanced. We may not be politically balanced in
We're not
In
on
cabinet.
We're not on cabinet.
Well, no, I know we're not. I mean, I've been in cabinet long enough to know that we're not politically balanced. But at the end of the day, I still say that the majority administration will obviously get the vote. You know, make that decision. Okay, so people can have a say, but what kind of say do people actually get? Anyway, I mean, I can't argue that you've agreed to go to that. The council, as you say, rightly so, has agreed to go to a committee system. All I'm saying is I think that the first option, which Jim pointed out, I think would be the best.
Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for taking us through all of that, Philip. I suppose my thoughts in terms of just the practicalities of it is that I would like to avoid double handling of any issues, because I think it would be hugely confusing for us in operationalising your wants and your decisions. So I would like real clarity in terms of, you know, which if it is a two committee, which committee something goes to, and maybe Philip, you want to just talk a little bit more about that. Is it accurate to say that anything with a budget implication over a certain agreed threshold would go to resources, and anything else that doesn't have a budget implication would go to the second committee? So I'll ask you to just respond to that to give a bit of clarity. But my principle being, I really don't want items to go to both committees unless they absolutely are required to, for obvious reasons. And then my second point is really around, when do you need a decision? Is it today that you need a decision in order for you to progress the other work that then builds on this? So it would just useful to have an indication of what we are asking members on this, whether it is the first or the second model. Perhaps you could just address those, Philip. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Working backwards, these are fundamental questions. You know, those of, do you have a one committee and overview and scrutiny, or two committees and other means of discussing or dealing with disagreements? It is fundamental. So there is a limited amount of work that we can take each way, but there is some time now to be able to test this out with other members. There's the workshop coming up. It will be nice to have a clearer steer, but at some point, recognizing within the next 2 or 3 months, you'll need to have, be that a committee or elsewhere, something of a formal vote or a consensus on which way you're going. As Susan points out, there is a limit to that. In answer to Susan's question, the idea of splitting it in this way is to reduce that going to two committees. So it should, for almost all decisions, be very clear. Look down the list. Does it go to Communities Committee? If it's on the list, it goes to that committee. That's the end of it, unless with the two exceptions. One that's an exception for both, which is, of course, where things are reserved to full council, so they go through a committee on their way to full council. But that's still not going through two committees. The only exception, which is for very much actually for Susan and the Chief Finance Officer to advise on, which is where a decision going to the Communities Committee will have such an impact on the budget that it really needs the view of the Resources Committee and leadership of the council to say yay or nay on before going forward. That can be a very small list, and that's why we've got a letter N in there, because there will come a point when, you know, there is, for example, a environment. So Communities Committee says yes, no, it's fine to move all the money from spending on car parks, and we'll spend them on swimming pools instead, and that fundamentally alters the budget, and the rest of the council goes, well, hang on a minute. So you're building in up front a limit to being able to play with money in that way, or to let contracts over a certain size, or to buy and sell land over a certain value. That intended in this model is the only thing that will go through the two committees. Does that help and feed into your thinking, Susan?
Yeah, thank you for just taking a bit of time, Philip. I think it's really important that we're clear So items that have a budgetary impact of above a certain threshold would be considered by the Resources Committee as shown on your screen. Matters of pure policy or an update, a refresh, or things that are within existing budget would be dealt with by the Environment and Communities Committee to the right hand of your screen. Is that a correct?
Yes. So
the understanding, Philip.
Yes. No. So for example, if we pick their public open space, if it's within budget, and that may be a huge budget, but there is a new contract to be let for the management of open space, you know, of several million. If that's within the budget, then it will go to Communities Committee. That will be it, the end of the matter. If it busted that budget, or actually Resources Committee just stamped its feet and said, we want to have the last say on this because it's this amount of money, then that will be the bounce. But that's the managerial and political decision to be made as to whether or not it's a good idea in certain circumstances to have it go to two committees. But one would hope that because it's all in the budget up front, it wouldn't need to do that. And as you say, you've divided the functions of the council in such a way that you don't need a senior committee to go around stamping its feet. So you can avoid things going to the two committees.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a design point of view, I think it's really important that we don't design in that just because I don't want it to be mishandled or delay decision making and lead to confusion. So I think it's a really important point. But thank you for clarifying, Philip.
And we can build that in, so we can actually say, all spending within budget would only ever go to the one committee.
Okay.
That's it.
And then the second point, if I just may come back on when a decision is needed of either the two or the one. Sorry, did I hear you correctly to say that you would need a vote on it? And is that of the broader membership? Is that of this working party?
I think we need a clear view to go forward. It doesn't have, because it can't be today, can it? That's not how democracy works. But sooner the better. Really, I think the clock's ticking. Realistically, once you're into November, we would struggle to start redesigning all of this.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Councillor Hollingby.
At long last. Can you, this is probably a silly question, can you be a member of both of these committees?
Yes.
You can, right? Okay,
yes.
That's interesting. And from what you've said, that if perhaps the Resources Committee were not happy with the decision that the communities had made, they can actually ask for it to go to them.
That's something to discuss in a moment. Moving on.
Right, okay, thank you.
If I may. So if we just reserve that thought. Members, are you happy that I move on from this list? That this is a list you can take away and give us, question number one, are you satisfied that this two committee route is the one you want to go down? And then number two, that then leaves time, quite a bit of time, to continue talking about exactly where sits where and what values are where. And, picking up Susan's point of making it a very hard line between the two, so that there's, you can avoid going through two committees and wasting lots of time. That's an easy fix. And if you're comfortable with taking that view, we can start building that in. So as I say, that's what it will look like. The discussion with officers, if you're comfortable with this, is your council will be easier to administer with two separate committees for regulatory work. So one for planning and then you've got members who are interested in planning, because let's be honest, there are always members who are interested in planning and nothing else in the world. That's just how local government works, isn't it? And then a separate one for licensing, and just to reflect again, that there's been a recent Court of Appeal case that's confirmed that there is actually two licensing committees. This is just something I'm afraid you're going to have to do. It's a sleight of hand, but officially there were 2 licensing committees, but they'll have exactly the same number of members. Just, first half of the meeting they'll be called Licensing Regulatory, second half of the meeting Licensing Act, because it actually runs on completely separate tram lines. And for their subcommittees, they have can now have completely different rules. Just going back to the other committees, strongly suggest you have a subcommittee for the shareholder function. You will have to have staffing subcommittees, and you raise the prospect. So I put it there with a question mark of a subcommittee for housing. But actually, if you can fit it all in the one committee, all the better. So just to take you through, I've shared a document of just some comparative notes between how the committee system works and the cabinet system works. I know it'll be grandmother to sucking eggs, but that may be a useful document for us to flick through in a moment. And you also asked me, because this is fairly novel, to actually what would a council spokesperson look like? What would they do? Because by and large, where these exists, they're not formal offices. They don't carry special responsibility allowance. They are just a focal point. So that's what it would look like if you had those 9 members, including leader and deputy leader, to be the political focal point of the council. So it will be to be the person to bounce things off, to be the person to send to external meetings on those issues, to go around looking at best practice in other places, and then just a bit of a role description of, you politically will be seen as the council's expert in this area. So again, that's something for you to take away and have a think about, A, whether or not you want these bodies, and B, whether that's the right kind of description. And if I switch to those notes, we thought it just worth rehearsing some of these. If they pop questions into your mind to ask as we go through. So, and if there are new people watching this, it's worth underscoring it, which is that firstly, we can produce role descriptions for what is a leader and deputy leader, what is a political group leader, so on and so forth. They're just useful touchstones, because in the committee system, formally, unless you write it in, there is no such thing as a leader. It is simply the leader of the largest political group, is how it used to be described in the old days. One very useful thing that people are doing is to say, actually, the traditional role of the leader of the council, which is the chair of the resources committee, let's formally put those 2 things together. So each year, when appointing the committees, and the full council appoints the chair and vice chair of resources committee, they say these are also the people that the council recognises as leader and deputy leader of the council, so they can fulfil those other functions of being the focal point for outside businesses, for the council offices and so forth, in getting business done. But it is worth just underscoring that leader and deputy leader now becomes an informal role rather than a formal one. The formal one is of chair and vice chair of the resources committee, which is a fundamental difference to the current system, where so many things are in the gift of the leader and the leader only. End of conversation. So just picking up on that last point, spokespersons as informal roles, those kind of portfolio holders of interest, as opposed to cabinet members, and they can be a useful thing. That's as you discussed previously. Group leaders, we can do a role description, because group leaders do have a formal role in law, which is appointing members to groups and in terms of picking up on conduct and discipline and so forth. And then likewise, there are out there, and councils have found it useful to put in their constitution at this stage, a bit of a job description of what the chair of a committee does, and whether or not you want to recognise, when putting agendas together and agenda management, group spokespersons in meetings. So, popping those in there. So I've just popped in there as well the differences in the committees. So of course in cabinet, there is cabinet, all the executive functions are on that. There is a set of regulations that does a similar thing as I described a moment ago, but in the other way, which is to say, here is a list of functions which are not to be the responsibility of the executive. Everything else is, like it or not, it's a really hard wall. Now you no longer have that hard wall and you can place things where you wish them to be, pure and simple. And the fact that all committees are politically balanced and subject to those delightful discussions that you're going to have every year. I have a spreadsheet which some people say they still have nightmares over when I've shared the maths that goes with it, over who gets what on what committee and how. And that's the case unless you unanimously agree, or rather no one votes against taking it out of political balance. And there are always some places that do. So some places say for, and it will be a suggestion here, so for the licensing panels, for example, so they're not politically balanced. Actually, there's a vote of members. You will vote each year to say, yes, practically it's a great idea. We'll try and get multi-party members, but at the end of the day, we get the members who are willing to come and sit for a day and sit in a licensing hearing, so you will take some things out of political balance, and you may wish to think about other committees that you take out of political balance. Overview and scrutiny as a set of functions. It's a very strange bit of law that says you must declare in your constitution and vote at full council to have overview and scrutiny or not have overview and scrutiny, and you can't just adopt a bit of it. If you want it, you get all of it, which is a rather blunt instrument, but there are other ways to go about these things if you want to retain some of the issues. I've just explained the Licensing Act Committee. So say there was a Court of Appeal decision, which is quite helpful because it says for Licensing Act regulatory panels, they don't have to be in person. You can do them remotely because they live on this separate little world. Audit and governance as now. And then whether or not to have key decisions is entirely your choice, but it's suggested as a means of being able to hold things in. My only suggestion is where at the moment, because it's a legal definition, it says it must, you might want to insert the words normally or something like that, just to give you a little bit of wiggle room should the offence require it. And then there are the two documents I've shared, and I know you won't all have had time to go through them, but I can go through them now if you wish, which is two means of, in effect, withdrawing delegation. So council saying, we delegate these functions to you, except, and there being a trigger for that. So one will be the trigger to say, this is a key decision on the forward plan due to be taken by an officer. What are the circumstances that would allow the council to say, no, we don't want an officer to take it, it's got to go to committee. And then the other being a form of what you now have as call-in, which is to say a decision, either by an officer or a committee. There are a number of councillors who are unhappy with that decision, and if they meet a certain criteria, so unhappy that responsibility for that decision is removed from that committee or that officer and either sent to Resources Committee or sent to full council for them to decide either to review and send back in overview and scrutiny fashion, or actually to say, you know what, no, we're dealing with this, and they take a decision instead. And I'll go through that in a moment. Councillor Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. So in that process, the decision would only be subject to referral to a council once. Is that correct? You couldn't keep recycling it?
No, absolutely not. Otherwise, you'll be there for the next 5 years on a controversial decision. That's anything but agile. So it will be built into that. But I'd say this is entirely a choice. So that referral process of officers up to committee, that's not that unusual. That rescission process, that committee system version of call-in, actually those that have done it, a number of them have stopped doing it, and a number have said up front they're not going to do it. So that's entirely a choice, and the world is probably 60-40 against a rescission process.
Okay, and just in terms of things that and coming back to something that Jenny said earlier on, actually, things that need urgent attention, there would be a separate process and a separate definition for managing those things that we would need to be very reactive to. Is that the kind of thing that would need to be put into the Constitution?
Yes, so all of these things, and you'll see it on the document. So both referral and rescission will have the ability for the decision maker to say, actually, no, that's not going to count on this occasion because we can't hang about. This is an urgent decision. So, if, God forbid, lockdown and COVID happened again, you would need officers to just go out and make decisions in your stead. And that will be that, really. And you will have stepped back and go, this is emergent. This is an emergency. Susan, you're now responsible for the whole show. And a process for doing that. Councillor Pater.
Thank you. Yeah, the revocation and rescission documents which you provided, or procedures which you provided, really do cover that, and they give some good grounds. I accept that a number of councils or a number of organisations may not think that there should be a rescission process. I think that there should, but I'd set the bar on it very high. So I'd certainly be looking for rescission of a decision. We're probably talking 50% of council to sign for that, as far as I'm concerned. So you're looking to make that a really high bar to clear for rescission. Probably slightly lower, but again, quite a difficult bar to cross for revocation. So I think you'd be looking at least, probably around the membership, or certainly the majority of the membership of a committee, in order to be looking for revocation of a decision. And you'd mentioned in there, making potentially it cross group, maybe it's cross group and cross committee to do a revocation. But the bar for a rescission should absolutely be a high one. So we're looking at, say, potentially 50% of council or something along that. And you've done some good caveating in there. Your example of that, which was absolutely this is your decision at number, said 3 or more, and I'm thinking way bigger than that. And I think that's where I'd see that. I think rescission should be used under an exceptional circumstances, and when there is an absolutely clear desire to sit by council to see that come back.
No, thank you, Councillor Pater. All I've done in that is simply copy across the criteria for your current call-in. So I would agree with you entirely that that's the starting point, the lowest bar. There are examples of councils that have this, that genuinely say it must be half of the council. So 50% of the council's members is required to make this happen. On a, everyone signed up to an email.
I'd have no problem with it being that sort of level. I think that's a good bar. If you can get 50% of councillors to say this decision needs to be discussed before it's enacted, I think it's likely to be an important one at that stage. And it should be 50% and cross-party in some way, I think.
So this is the rescission. As you can see, it's fairly straightforward. It copies across your call-in criteria and procedure, and thank you for Councillor Pater for allowing that tinkering with the number of members, because it is extremely important. Because what it means is, so for example, if this was a decision at Resources Committee, the delegation would have been removed after the event, and the decision then retaken or at the very least reviewed at full council. So these are fairly heavy. So it's a lot stronger than simply calling, which would review something and then send it back. This is actually saying, you know, we are taking it to the senior place, be that a committee if it's an officer, resources if it's communities committee, or council if it's resources, to say, actually, we're going to not only look at this, but we could send it back, or we could actually say, no, we'll take the decision. So, and most commonly, as I've seen it in other councils, is usually one of the other committees and pulled into the resources committee. And I know of one council where as I say, one was a test for going to full council, half of the council, another it was half of the equivalent of the resources committee saying, we want it to come to us rather than anywhere else. And then referral of officer, key decisions by officers. The suggestion here is, so 5 members of one of the policy committees, more than one political group, and should either include spokesperson or the chair or vice chair. So again, underlining, if you're saying to an officer, you can't take this decision anymore, it's all got to be put on ice until it can go to a committee, the reasons for that and the trigger for that must be quite a high bar. And so this again is a starter for 10 for what that high bar is, because it, you know, could involve a month's delay in what could be quite important decisions. So built in again will be the ability actually, so for example, if it was a decision by Susan to say, yes, I know you're the councillors, but this really has to be done, and so I'm going to stand my ground, and we're going to make the decision. But these are all things for you to have a think about and then bring back to a future meeting to agree, if you want this kind of process, because both of these processes are entirely voluntary. You don't have to have either. And as I say, many councils have neither. In terms of taking decisions away from officers and bringing to committee, you know, you could actually say, well, you trust your officers to have enough nous to be able to do that. That if an officer always has the choice in conversation with the chair or with the leader of the council to say, actually, yeah, this is quite important, and this is an issue of real interest to the community and needs to be knocked about in a political open room where people can sit at the back and watch, and therefore we'll bring it to committee. That's the normal working of the council. So one can put a very good argument across to say this is not necessary at all. Likewise, on rescission, the whole point of a committee system and the streamlined one is to say you've now got cross-party membership on these committees, so you shouldn't need space after a meeting to say, oh, you know what, we've had another think about it and that was a mistake, and we need another set of members, more important members, to pull a plug on it and have another go at it. Which is why, as I say, in both of these instances, by far and away the majority of councils have neither. But these are here for you to go away and have a think about. Councillor Hollingby.
Yes, thank you. So if there was an urgent decision to be made, I mean, COVID was a typical example. The chief executive would speak to the leader. What power does a leader have in terms of agreeing to what the chief executive might want to do? Or does that have to go, or would he have to call, or would he or she have to call or set up a meeting of the resources committee to discuss that?
So I think you raised an interesting point there, because the position of the leader is one of influence. So where something is delegated to someone, they can never fetter their discretion. They can never say, in making my decision, I'm going to do what somebody else tells me to do. So the leader is a consultee in that situation. So as you can see on the screen there, if the decision is one delegated to the chief executive, and sorry to put you in the spot again, Susan, But in COVID, and Susan says for reasons of public health, I believe this is so important. I'm going to make the decision. You've given me in the Constitution the power to do it, so I'm going to do it because it's an emergency. Talk to the leader, talk to the group leaders, get you around a table, hear what you've got to say, but the decision whether or not to withdraw this and still go ahead will be hers.
Thank you.
And that's a fail safe, because you can gather from the way I've just described it, it will be a very brave chief executive who sits in front of all of the group leaders and goes, yeah, I don't care what you think, I'm going to do what I think. Because it may not be in job too long. So, you know, but we build these fail safes in. But that still doesn't underlie the point that actually in a normal, healthy council, particularly in a cross-party system, neither of these are really needed. And if they are in the Constitution, they're things of rarity.
Thank you.
Any other matters, members? Well, on that, members, that's a fair old download from us. To the point it may have made your brains hurt, I'm not sure. But there's a lot there to chew over, to go back to your groups, to have, you know, discussions with officers. You know, so and the key point being here, do you want those two policy committees, and if so, how hard do we draw the line between them, and what's on what side of the line? You know, you've heard from Susan that says actually that should be a very hard line. There shouldn't be much that's porous between those two committees, because, you know, you don't want to replicate what you've got now, which is where you have one issue that goes to multiple committees on multiple occasions, particularly if they're already things that are going to full council. So if you're going to have those two committees, what goes on what side of the line? And the thinking being, it's quite the easiest way to deal with it is to say, like, what goes to the communities committee? There's a hard list. Everything else goes to resources. And then the other hard list is what's reserved to full council. And at the moment you have a statutory list, which is quite short, +1, which is your annual corporate plan.
I think where we're to there, that's probably the right place to leave that. Although I think Susan's dropped off the meeting and trying to get back in. I think what you've put forward here is a really solid basis for us to go forward. And as I've made the point is that I think that the two committee model is the way forward. And although I accept your points of revocation and rescission, I quite like having an emergency button. But I think it should be an emergency button which is really hard to push, or requires a lot of support in order to use under those circumstances. But that's the purpose for them being there, as far as I'm concerned, is to be that check and balance against. There will be an increased level of delegation under this system, and it gives the ability for that to be rowed back if there is a large amount of support for doing so, but still allows, as you say, section 6 with the exclusion from removal of delegation, it does give the possibility for a committee or indeed an officer to turn around and go, we've got to do this and we've got to do this now, and we will face the consequences of that later. So it does allow those decisions to be made where it is in the case of the council or public's interest, and I think that's really important, that it gives that flexibility, it gives that ability to officers and committees to do stuff quickly if they really need to, but has that check. But there's for the huge majority of business, there is allowed to be that check and balance in place. And I said, I'd like to hope that it's one of that revocation and rescission are bits of the Constitution that we'll look at in 2 or 3 years' time and go, actually, we've never used it. Quietly can it, but on the other hand, at this stage, it's about rebuilding the trust of council in how we're doing this, and that we are putting the council back in control. And by having that mechanism there, it just gives them sure certainty that that's what's happened. But as you say, I think groups will go away and discuss this, but hopefully we can turn this around quite quickly and come back to you with answers on A, the number of committees, B, totally understand the porosity question. It should be in that list, or that person, or that, but it shouldn't ping pong. And that they come back with decisions on whether rescission and revocation, and hopefully they will look at those and go, either yes, they should be there, or no, they shouldn't. But if they say yes, they should be there, let's make it a high bar for them to be used.
Thank you.
That's great, councillors. Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Philip. And both Gemma and I will touch base with all of you after this meeting. In terms of the agenda for the next meeting, again, we will finalise that. And also any paperwork relating to it will be circulated to you before the meeting. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you, Philip.
That's really helpful. Amandeep, before we quit, where's the decision go on this? Do we need a decision to go through a council meeting in terms of two committee structure, etc., or are we comfortable with doing this under consultation with groups and coming back with informal answers to these questions?
I would have thought the latter, Councillor Prater, if you as members are happy with that approach. And of course, Philip, yourself as well.
Yeah, if it's any help, members, when I've done these before, we've kind of had a weighted vote, you might say, in the within the working groups. So there's a forward calculation of how a vote might go at full council, and everyone kind of goes, yeah, okay, yeah, that works. Only on one issue, where one group said, no, we really need to take this to a public vote, was an issue taken into the equivalent of your governance committee, constitution committee, and a public vote was had there where a disagreement was sorted. But that was one time on one particular issue. Everything else and everyone else has been either by consensus or just by waiting, where a smaller group has said, yeah, no, we recognise when this isn't going to run, so we give way. And that allows us, particularly in the time frame you've got, to go away and get the work done.
Okay, again, many thanks from me.
Can I just say, in response to that, Tim, I think this is an online meeting now. Everybody and anybody can view and listen and see and find out what we're saying. To go to full council at this point, when we haven't made any recommendations in the setup, I think would be not appropriate. So I'm very happy to go back to my group and talk things through and come back with our views.
Thank you. That's very useful. And both Gemma and I will be in touch with all of you to get your feedback, which of course we will discuss within the management team and with Philip as well. So that's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, everybody, and we shall see you at the next working group meeting.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you all.